The sound of the gold piece hitting the table was not loud, yet it echoed in the small, dusty room like a gavel striking a judge's bench. It was a final sound, a sound that severed the past from the future. Alara stood by the window, her back to the two men. She focused on the grime trapped in the corner of the glass pane, a small, triangular accumulation of dust that had been there for years. If she looked at the dust, she did not have to look at her father's hands, shaking as they reached for the coin. If she looked at the dust, she did not have to look at the man who had just purchased her. "She's quiet," her father said, his voice scraping against the silence. It was a nervous sound, thin and reedy. "Don't give no trouble. Knows her way around a stove. Stronger than she looks, too." "I didn't come for conversation, Elias," the other man said. His voice was different, deep, resonant, like earth shifting underground. It was the voice of Silas Thorne. "And I didn't come for a recommendation. The debt is cleared. The deed to the lower pasture is returned. We are concluded." "She's a good girl," her father added, the coin already vanishing into his pocket. "She is my wife now," Silas corrected him. The tone was devoid of warmth, devoid of possession, even. It was simply a statement of legal fact, as dry as the paper the marriage license was written on. "Get your things, Alara." She turned then. She did not look at her father. That bond had withered years ago, starved by his neglect, and sold off piece by piece at card tables and saloons. She looked at Silas Thorne. He was a mountain of a man, etched from the hard country that birthed him. His coat was dark wool, dusted with the pale clay of the road. His face was a map of sharp lines and weathered skin, his eyes the color of slate, gray, impenetrable, and cold. He held his hat in his hands, not out of deference, but out of habit. He did not look at her with lust, nor with kindness. He looked at her as one might look at a new fence post, checking for rot, assessing its utility. She had packed her bag 3 days ago, the night he had lost the final hand of poker. She picked up the worn carpet bag from the floor. It contained 2 dresses, a mother-of-pearl hair comb that she had hidden beneath a floorboard, and a book of poetry with the cover torn off. She walked past her father without pausing. She felt the ghost of his hand reach out, perhaps to pat her shoulder, perhaps to feign a goodbye, but she moved just enough to let his hand fall through empty air. The door opened and the wind of the plains hit her face. Dry, vast, and indifferent. Silas climbed onto the buckboard of his wagon and waited. He did not offer a hand to help her up. It was a test, she realized. Or perhaps it was simply an assumption that a woman sold for a debt was used to hard climbing. She threw her bag into the back and pulled herself up onto the wooden seat beside him. He flicked the reins. The horses, massive drafts with coats like polished obsidian, leaned into the harness. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the peeling paint of her father's house behind. They drove for 2 hours in absolute silence. The landscape rolled out around them, a sea of sagebrush and golden grass, turning amber in the late afternoon light. The mountains in the distance were jagged teeth, biting into the violet sky. "I have rules," Silas said finally. He did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "I value order. I value quiet. The house is large, and Mrs. Gable manages the kitchen. But she is getting old. You will assist her. You will manage the linens. You will keep out of my study." Alara nodded. He glanced at her then, a brief, sharp assessment. You have a tongue, don't you? Elias said you were quiet, not mute. Alara looked at him. Her eyes were brown, dark, and clear, like a river running over deep stones. She held his gaze. She did not open her mouth. He frowned, a tightening of the jaw. Suit yourself. Silence is a virtue in a woman, they say. See that you keep it from turning into insolence. He turned back to the road. He thought she was sullen. He thought she was simple. Let him think it. Silence was the only thing she owned. It was the only territory her father hadn't been able to sell. It was her fortress, and she would not lower the drawbridge for a man who thought he had bought the right to cross it. The Thorn Ranch was not a home. It was a monument to industry. The main house was 2 stories of whitewashed timber and dark stone, imposing and severe against the backdrop of the foothills. It sat in the center of a sprawling empire of cattle and timber, a kingdom run with military precision. Inside, the house was clean, cold, and echoing. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was a woman made of angles and starch. She looked Alara up and down when they arrived, her lips thinning. The master said he was bringing a wife, Mrs. Gable said, wiping her hands on her apron. I suppose you'll do. You're thin. We eat at 6. Work starts at 5. Don't expect to be waited on just because you wear a ring. Mr. Thorne doesn't abide idleness. Alara did not expect to be waited on. She expected nothing. Her life at the ranch settled into a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She rose before the sun. She hauled water. She scrubbed the pine floors until they glowed like honey. She mended the heavy canvas coats of the ranch hands and the fine linen shirts of her husband. She saw Silas mostly at dinner. The dining room was vast, dominated by a long mahogany table that could seat 20. They sat at opposite ends. Silas at the head, Alara at the foot. 10 feet of polished wood between them. The meals were silent affairs. The clink of silver against china was the only conversation. Silas would read a ledger or a newspaper while he ate, barely acknowledging her presence. To him, she was a fixture, a ghost that ensured his coffee was hot and his socks were darned. He did not know that she read the books in the library when he was out riding the fence lines. He did not know that she had fixed the broken, mesmerizing gears of the clock in the hallway. He did not know that she was the one who left the small vases of wildflowers on the windowsill in the kitchen, bringing a rare softness to the austere house. He thought she was dull. One evening, 3 weeks after her arrival, a storm battered the house. Rain lashed against the windows like gravel. The wind howled down the chimney. Silas sat by the fire in the drawing room, nursing a glass of whiskey. Alara sat in a chair in the corner, mending a tear in his riding jacket. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the room. The creek will rise tonight, Silas murmured, more to the fire than to her. I'll lose the fencing in the north pasture. He looked at her. She continued to stitch, the needle flashing in the light. Her head was bowed, her neck exposed, pale and slender. For a moment he felt a strange prickle of irritation. Do you understand what I say? He asked, his voice louder. Or is your head as empty as the air out there? Alara stopped sewing. She set the jacket down on her lap and looked at him. Her expression was calm, unreadable. She nodded once. Then why do you not speak? He demanded. He stood up, his large frame filling the room. I have provided you a home. I have clothed you. I have saved you from the ruin your father built. Do I not deserve a word, a thank you, a good evening? She watched him. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the loneliness etched around his mouth that he tried to hide with a beard and a scowl. He was a man used to command, used to the world bending to his voice. Her silence was the one thing he could not command, and it baffled him. She stood up, placing the mended jacket neatly on the chair. She walked to the small side table where a pitcher of water stood. She poured a glass and brought it to him, setting it down beside his whiskey. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps soundless on the rug. Silas stared at the water. It was a small gesture, almost mocking in its simplicity. Yet as he looked at the jacket she had left, he saw the stitching. It was invisible. Tiny, perfect stitches that matched the grain of the fabric so perfectly the tear had vanished. It was not the work of a simpleton. It was the work of an artist. He sat back down, the whiskey forgotten. The silence of the house felt different now. It didn't feel empty. It felt heavy with something he couldn't name. Winter arrived early in the high country. It came with a sky the color of bruised iron and a wind that cut through wool and skin alike. The ranch hunkered down. The cattle were moved to the lower valleys. The wood piles grew high against the house. Alara's world shrank to the interior of the house. She took over the baking from Mrs. Gable, whose arthritis flared in the cold. The house began to smell of yeast and cinnamon, of rosemary and roasting meat. Silas spent more time indoors, trapped by the snow. He worked in his study, the door usually closed. But slowly the door began to stay ajar. He began to watch her. He watched her from the top of the stairs as she swept the hallway. He watched her through the window as she threw grain to the chickens, wrapping her shawl tight against the cold. He noticed that she never shivered, never complained, never slumped. She moved with a dignity that seemed out of place for a woman bought for a debt. He noticed other things too. He found his favorite book, Meditations, which he had left on the side table, moved. It was not just tidied. A bookmark was placed in it, marking a passage he had not read in years. A passage about the stoic acceptance of fate. Does she read, he wondered, or was it chance? One evening he returned from the barn, his hands numb with cold. He stomped the snow from his boots in the mudroom. When he entered the kitchen, he found a basin of hot water waiting on the bench, a clean towel beside it, and a mug of coffee steaming on the table. Alara was at the stove, her back to him. He washed his hands, the heat stinging his frozen skin. He picked up the coffee. It was sweetened with honey, just the way he liked it, though he had never told her. "Alara," he said. She turned. Her face was flushed from the heat of the stove. A smudge of flour was on her cheek. It made her look younger, softer. "The north barn," he said, his voice rough. "The roof is holding under the snow. I checked it." It was the first time he had offered her information about the ranch that wasn't in order. It was an offering, a small, clumsy bridge. She nodded, a small incline of her head. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small tin. She walked over to him and placed it on the table. He opened it. It was a salve. He smelled it, arnica and tallow. "For your hands," he said. "You made this?" She nodded. He looked at his hands. They were cracked and bleeding from the dry cold and the leather rains. He looked at her hands. They were red from scrubbing, the knuckles raw. He took the tin. "Thank you." She turned back to the stove. That night Silas sat in his study. He did not read the ledger. He stared into the fire. He realized he did not know the color of her voice. He did not know if she sang. He did not know if she cried. In 3 months, he had never heard her weep. He had bought a wife to settle a debt, thinking he was acquiring a burden to manage. Instead, he felt as though he was living with a riddle he was desperate to solve. The power imbalance that had defined their beginning. Money for flesh, shelter for labor, was shifting. Her silence was not submission. It was a wall, and he was beginning to realize he was on the outside of it. The turning point came not with a shout, but with a whisper of paper. It was mid-January. A blizzard had buried the valley for 3 days. The house was an island in a white ocean. Silas was in a foul mood. He had lost a calf to the cold, and the stress was gnawing at him. He sat at the dining table, surrounded by papers. He was trying to balance the year's accounts, but the numbers weren't adding up. He rubbed his temples, growling in frustration. "Damned incompetent clerks," he muttered. "The feed bill is missing." He stood up to pour himself more coffee, pacing the room. When he turned back, Alara was standing by the table. She was looking down at the scattered papers. "Don't touch those," he snapped, his temper fraying. "It's a mess, and you'll only lose the order." She did not step back. She reached out a hand, a slender, pale hand, and picked up a sheet of paper, then another. She moved them, sliding one under the other, rearranging the chaotic spread into 3 neat piles. "Ilara, I said leave it," he warned, stepping forward. She ignored him. She picked up his pen. Silas froze. "What are you doing?" She dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her hand did not shake. On the back of a wasted envelope she wrote. The scratch of the nib was loud in the room. She wrote for a minute, then set the pen down and stepped back. She looked at him. Her chin lifted, her eyes challenging him. Silas walked to the table. He looked at the envelope. In elegant, flowing script, far better than his own blocky hand, she had written, "The feed bill is accounted for in the November ledger, page 42. You have counted the grain shipment twice in the December tally. The error is $40 in your favor." Silas stared at the words. He read them 3 times. He looked at the ledgers. He flipped to November, page 42. There it was. He checked his December tally. She was right. He looked up at her. She was watching him, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't a simpleton. She wasn't merely literate. She was educated. She was sharp. "You can read," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can write." She nodded. "Why?" he asked. "Why let me treat you like you understood nothing?" She walked over to the table again. She picked up the pen. "Because you never asked. You only ordered." Silas felt the words like a physical blow. He read the sentence, the ink glistening wetly. "You never asked." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes that he had mistaken for vacuousness. He saw the pride she held in her posture. He realized that her silence was not a disability. It was a judgment. She had judged him as a man who did not care to know her, and she had responded by withholding herself. Silas started, but the words died. He was a proud man, not used to apologizing, but the shame that washed over him was hot and sharp. He pulled out the chair at the side of the table, not the foot, but the side, close to him. "Sit," he said. It wasn't an order. It was a request. She hesitated. then sat. "The accounts," he said, pushing the stack of papers toward her. I have been looking at these for 6 hours. My eyes are failing me." It was a lie. His eyes were fine. It was a surrender. Alara picked up the pen. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the scratching of the nib and the crackle of the fire. They worked together. She pointed out errors. He corrected them. She organized the receipts. He tallied the totals. When the clock struck midnight, the work was done. The accounts were balanced. Silas closed the ledger. "You have a head for numbers." Alara wrote on her scrap paper, "My father was a gambler. I had to learn the odds to survive the losses." Silas felt a pang of anger, not at her, but for her. "He didn't deserve you." She looked at him, her gaze intense. She wrote one more line. "He sold me. He decided my worth was 20 acres of pasture and a cleared debt. What is my worth to you, Silas?" She pushed the paper to him. Silas read it. He looked at the woman sitting beside him. He thought of the cold house that was now warm. He thought of the mended clothes, the silent care, the sharp mind that had just saved him hours of torment. "You are not property, Alara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I was wrong to make this a transaction." She studied his face. She seemed to be searching for truth. Whatever she saw, it satisfied her. She nodded, then stood up. She did not write anything else. She went upstairs to her room. But that night she left her door open a crack. Spring came with a violence of green. The snow melted into rushing creeks, and the wildflowers exploded across the meadows. The relationship between Silas and Alara had changed. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was a companionable quiet. They rode together in the evenings, checking the herds. She wore riding leathers he had bought for her, the finest in town. He asked her opinion on the cattle sales. She wrote her answers on a slate he carried for her. He found himself rushing home from the fields, not for the food, but to see her, to see what she was reading, to see the small smile that sometimes graced her lips when he told a dry joke. He had fallen in love with her. It terrified him. He had bought a wife, but he had fallen in love with a woman who had never spoken his name. Then the past arrived. It was a Tuesday. Silas was in the barn when he heard the dogs barking. He walked out to see a familiar, ragged buckboard coming up the drive. Elias, Alara's father, climbed down. He looked worse than before, thinner, his clothes more threadbare. His eyes darted around the prosperous ranch with greedy calculation. Alara was on the porch. She had been sweeping. She stood frozen, the broom clutched in her hands like a weapon. "Afternoon, Silas," Elias called out, grinning a toothless grin. "Thought I'd visit my girl, see how she's settling in." Silas walked over, placing himself between the man and the porch. "You have no business here, Elias. The deal is done." Now, Elias wheedled. "A father can't visit? I heard you had a good winter. Cattle prices are up." "What do you want?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Just a small loan," Elias said, his voice dropping. "Bad run of luck. They're going to take the house if I don't pay up. I thought, seeing as I gave you such a prize." He gestured vaguely at Alara. Silas felt a red rage cloud his vision. "You sold her," he snarled. "You don't get to leverage her again." "She's my flesh and blood," Elias shouted, sensing weakness. "I have rights. Alara, you tell him. You tell him to help your poor old pa." Silas turned to look at Alara. She was trembling. Her face was pale as milk. Her eyes were wide with a terror that Silas had never seen before. It wasn't just fear. It was the memory of every blow, every hungry night, every moment of shame this man had inflicted on her. "She doesn't speak to the likes of you," Silas said, turning back to Elias. "Get off my land." "I ain't leaving without $500!" Elias screamed. He stepped forward, pushing past Silas toward the porch. "Ilara, you ungrateful wretch! Get inside and get his cash box!" Silas grabbed Elias by the collar. He was going to hit him. He was going to break him. "No." The word was quiet. It was rusty, unused, and hoarse. But it cut through the air like a knife. Silas froze. Elias froze. Ilara stood on the top step. She had dropped the broom. Her hands were fists at her sides. She was shaking, but her chin was high. "No," she said again. This time the voice was stronger. It was low, melodic, and trembling with a lifetime of suppressed fury. "Ilara?" Elias gasped. You can talk?" "I chose not to talk to you," she said. Each word was a struggle, a stone pushed up a hill. "Because you never listened. You only took." She took a step down.
"You sold me," she said. "You sold me like a cow. And that sale, it freed me from you." She looked at Silas. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was smiling, a small, brave smile. "I am home," she said to her father. "This is my home. You have no place here." Elias looked at her, then at Silas, who was looking at his wife with an expression of awe and fierce pride. The old man saw the wall of unity between them. He saw that his power, the power of fear, was broken. He spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and climbed back into his wagon. They watched him leave. They watched until the dust settled and the wagon was a speck on the horizon. Silas turned to Ilara. She was still trembling. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her weak. He walked up the steps. He did not touch her at first. He stood before her, close enough to feel her warmth. "You spoke," he whispered. "I had to," she rasped. Her throat hurt. He was going to make you violent. I didn't want his blood on your hands." "You saved me again," Silas said. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold. He chafed them gently between his own. "Ilara," he said, "I am sorry. For the beginning, for everything." She looked up at him. "The beginning is over, Silas." "And now?" he asked. She pulled one hand free and touched his cheek. Her fingers were rough from work, but her touch was gentle. "Now," she said, her voice gaining a little more strength, a little more music. "Now we are just us." Silas Thorne, the man who owned the valley, the man who commanded men and beasts, felt a tear track through the dust on his face. He leaned into her hand. "Just us," he repeated. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a hungry kiss. It was a slow, deliberate pressing of lips, a seal on a new covenant. It tasted of salt and promise. Around them, the ranch continued its work. The cattle lowed in the distance. The wind rustled the cottonwoods. But on the porch, in the quiet afternoon, the silence was finally broken, replaced by the sound of two hearts beating in a rhythm they had forged together, out of debt, out of snow, and into the spring. The sun dipped below the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the land they owned. Together.